The meeting is now live.
Good morning. Shall I get started with the agenda then?
Yes, please.
Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Liverpool City Region Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I'd like to welcome all those present. This meeting will be broadcast live to the Combined Authority website and available for subsequent viewing. Can members and officers please ensure that when you wish to speak, you indicate in the chat box. When you're invited to speak, please unmute your microphone and switch on your camera. And please don't forget to turn your mic and camera off afterwards. Finally, can everyone ensure their phones are switched to silent, please? And I'll just reiterate that reminder about trying to make sure you're on mute at all times except when you're speaking, because it does affect the quality of the meeting. And can I also just add in a note from me that I am actually homeschooling 2 children at the same time as doing this. So there's a small chance that I will be interrupted, but my children are used to avoiding Dad when he's in meetings. So thank you very much for that. We'll go straight on to the first item, which is apologies for absence. Are there any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. We've had apologies from Councillor Jean Stapleton and Councillor Sarah Watson.
Thank you for that. They are noted. Has anybody else had any other notifications? In that case, we'll move on to item 2, which is a declaration of interest. Have any declarations of interest been received?
Thank you, Chair. We've had no declarations of interest for this meeting.
Thank you. So if there are no declarations of interest, can we move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 3, minutes of the last meeting of the LCR Overview and Scrutiny Committee, which was held on the 4th of November 2020. The minutes of the meeting of that meeting are included pages 1 to 8. Are the minutes now agreed and accepted as an accurate record of that meeting?
Agreed. Agreed.
That's great. Thank you very much for that. So moving on to item 4, it is the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority budget for 21-22, which is on pages 9 to pages 64. Please can I invite Steve Rotherham, Metro Mayor, to introduce the proposed budget to us. John Fogarty, Director of Corporate Services, will then present the budget proposal to us. Mayor, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. I will try to include as much of the current situation regarding the budget as possible, but I just need to give you and members perhaps a flavour of why we've made some of the tough decisions that we have made, and it's because of obviously the ongoing crises that we're in with the pandemic. But ahead of that combined authority budget, even though it is a mayoral presented budget on Friday, I'll give you the top lines, and that is that I've announced plans to freeze the cost of tunnels at the moment, which are currently at the lowest rate for 20 odd years. We're freezing the mayoral precept, and we're also freezing the transport levy for the year 21-22. And they have been very, very tough negotiations, deliberations and discussions. But we know that the past year has been uniquely challenging for everyone, and certainly for people in our city region, and we don't want to add any additional pressures, if at all possible, during the rest of the difficult period that we're going to have through pandemic and then hopefully into recovery. But these weren't decisions that were taken lightly. The reality is that COVID has created significant financial pressures for the local authorities and for the combined authority itself, and it's exacerbated the existing ones that we had as carryover, which you will understand from last year and from previous years. So our local authorities' finances and transport network in particular, as we know, have taken a battering as a result of the pandemic, you know, not just with paying out stuff, with the reductions in revenues also. And I have to say, Chair, that there have been a number of broken promises from government You know, I'm old enough to remember when Rishi Sunak first stood up and said, whatever it takes. And then we went from whatever it takes, from whatever we are prepared to give to you. So our local authorities went out and did all of those things, which is whatever it took. And then were found wanting in regard to the support that national government provided to it. And all of this is on top of a decade of austerity and, of course, the historical legacy of underfunding that we've seen in the north, especially, which has favoured the south, which means, of course, that there are still all of those difficult decisions ahead of us. But I've said all along that I'm committed to doing everything that I can to help the businesses and the people in our city region through the crisis. And it was about always saving lives, but also trying to ensure that we save livelihoods. And I've shown that where necessary, we will take the tough decisions that are in the best interest of the 1.6 million people in the Liverpool city region. But at the same time, of course, I'll always remain vocal to challenge the government to ensure that they step up to the plate when they need to and demonstrate that there is substance behind some of those promises that were made. So the latest one, of course, we're all aware of is levelling up. What does that actually mean to us? So we need to ensure that the government starts by supporting essential public services in our city region. I suppose that's why the budget remains focused on securing the city region's economic recovery, because it prioritises investments in infrastructure and then, of course, in skills and our environment. And I'm very proud of my record so far on what we've done in regard to those main planks of our strategy. And I'm determined that, you know, despite the huge challenges the effects of the pandemic will have on combined authority budgets in the medium term, that we will continue wherever to support the region's economy and to protect those jobs through this next difficult budget period, 21-22. So the budget makes special provision for a number of key strategic priorities over the next few months. And of those, I suppose, Chair, the most significant ones, as you'll have teased out, are the Mersey Tidal project, absolutely essential to the future of the Liverpool city region, but also to UK PLC. We need to move towards renewables, and I believe with hydrogen, because we've got huge and ambitious plans for hydrogen in our city region, with the offshore wind cluster, which is Europe's largest, just down the road in Barebow Bank, with what we're trying to do with high intensity and high usage for industrial processes through Glass Futures. There are a lot of things that we have here that can make us the UK's renewable energy coast, and that's what we'll be pushing on with. We also need to be looking at digital connectivity and digital inclusion, because we've seen, haven't we, with what happened with universities, first schools, but with benefits, and then with what we're doing now, digital connectivity is really important. Who'd have thought that we would have, you know, the back-to-back Zoom and Teams meetings that we've all had to endure during the last 10 months? Who'd have thought that pre-pandemic? And yet digital connectivity is hugely important, and that work has actually started, and we'll ramp that up over the next 12 months. We want to recover and reform the bus market. When I say recover, at this moment in time, hardly anyone's using our buses, and that's the right thing at this moment in time, but we need it to be a quality alternative in the future, and we want to reform the bus market so that we can achieve that in our city region and have that truly integrated London style transport system that takes into account active travel, the likes of buses and trains and our ferries, but also includes walking and cycling. And then we want to specifically support Halton's Borough of Culture, and it's just a real unfortunate quirk of fate, isn't it, that when Sefton had the opportunity to showcase some of the wonderful jewels that it has in its crown, that was taken away from it during the pandemic, because last year, you know, the current year, if you like, has been Sefton's year as Borough of Culture. And hopefully we'll see some of those exciting things that they were going to do this year still continue next year. And that means that the mayoral combined authority has to manage a significant portfolio of different investments across the city region, but that is to ensure that we improve economic growth and opportunities for all those people who rely on us, because they're not going to get it from national government, and we need to be doing that for our residents, of course, but for businesses, for visitors, and then for important sectors such as the visitor economy. And then if again to just tease out some of those things for you, the investments, certainly the larger ones that will progress through the different stages of delivery in this next 12 months, they're things like Shakespeare North Playhouse, a fantastic opportunity for Knowsley there to demonstrate that that can be part of the visitor economy. For Parkside Link Road, for the glass features thing that I've just referred to previously about those high usage industrial processes to be decarbonised. For the Liverpool city centre connectivity programme, we've seen some of that work continuing despite the pandemic. Really exciting project, which is the redevelopment of the Runcorn Station Quarter. I think that will be pivotal to Halton's future. The Headbolt Lane rail enhancements, and of course the new station there, which as a former Kirby lad, I'm really excited about, because I think that will open up public transport alternatives for a whole cohort of people who find that the current Kirby station is too far because you have to get there by a bus and then to use the train. So I think that'll be absolutely brilliant for people in that area, along with the other stuff that we're doing with Kirby Town Centre. There's Wirral Waters, of course, and the regeneration of Birkenhead. And then in Sefton, there's the Bootle and Southport Strategic Investment Fund schemes. And we'll say more about those, I'm sure, over the coming period. But I'm really, really excited about the possibilities. Certainly, I think Southport, talking about jewels in the crown earlier, Southport is an area that we could really put, hydrogen-powered turbo rocket boosters behind in the future. And then, Chair, if I can, just to explain about the big picture and the reason that we're doing some of these things budgetary, and it's obviously because of COVID, but because of the way that we've tried to work with national governments wherever it's in our interest. And I was actually the first regional leader to be invited to a COBRA meeting, but at that COBRA meeting, I wasn't just a guest, I was a representative of our area, and I told the Prime Minister and the Cabinet that I wouldn't accept the government's furlough light scheme. People will probably remember that it was scheduled to be set at 67%, and I used that as a platform to say that I wouldn't accept that, and we wanted to use the COVID Business Support Grant underspend in our area to top up that residual 13% for businesses in our area. Now, of course, what happened was both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor told me at that stage that it was a red line for government. But when London looked like it was going into a higher tier and then potentially into lockdown, all of a sudden 67% wasn't acceptable for those people down there, and it went to 80%. And myself and Andy Burnham, quite rightly, I think, called the government out on that one. And it's another one of those instances where it does demonstrate the north-south divide. But we did work with government, as I say, and we secured, for instance, a £44 million package of support from them to help us through the tier 3 restrictions. And all of these different tiers now seem so long ago, but tier 3 at that stage was the highest tier, people remember. And we got a package from government with that, which was, it wasn't bettered anywhere in the country because I had a parity clause with number 10. We created from that £40 million emergency fund for hospitality and leisure, which we launched here, and it was the first of its kind in the whole country, and nobody else yet has done the sort of things that we've done. We established the UK's first fund to support the excluded and forgotten group. £9.5 million we put into a pot. Actually, we needed closer to £100 million, but we put some of our funding into it because we identified that this is a national disgrace, that basically 3 million people have been left behind since day one and not had a penny from national government. And it was really encouraging to see the cross-party support yesterday for Tracy Braben's 10-minute rule bill. And again, myself and Andy Burnham and some of the other mayors have really got behind these campaigns. And I'm absolutely certain that the Chancellor will have to address this grave injustice that has been perpetrated against such a large sector of people who have done the right thing, you know, are not just people who are asking for handouts. These are people who are asking for parity, not charity. And so we want to support those people locally, and that's why we put our fund together. But we're the first again in the country to do anything like this. And in fact, I think we're the only ones in the country still to do anything like this. Is it enough? No, but with limited resources, we've put what we can to try and help those businesses in the Liverpool City region. We also launched LCR Cares Chair, which raised more than £2.5 million. That went to local community and voluntary organisations, and people again who are councillors will know them in their own areas. Hundreds of thousands of people have benefited from that, and some of those voluntary and community sector organisations would have gone under themselves only for the support that we were able to provide to them. So I'd like to thank all my team who really did the hard work on this, but really helped to crystallise and gel together all of those great institutions across the 6 districts to support local people in their areas. We led the calls, Chair, on the government to release local data. People will remember at that stage the government basically would not give us the data sets so that we could interrogate that and get it to a granular form where we understood what was going on in our areas. And so, you know, things like what sectors, what demographic, what geography was starting to see spikes would have been helpful, and the government wouldn't give us it. But again, capitulated at a much too late a date for me, for my liking. And it's the same now. We're asking them for the same sort of data. And I spoke to Nadine Sahawi the day before last about the government working with us so that we can understand the vaccination data and we can see what groups are taking up the opportunities to be vaccinated. And simple things like I was the first, myself and Sadiq Khan were the first people to request and campaign for mandatory face coverings in public spaces, and that could have changed the culture and made it much more able to get people to comply with what was happening. We removed the tolls, Chair, at that stage, and introduced free travel for NHS workers during the first lockdown, and that was because we wanted to protect our staff, obviously, who were working the toll booths, but also we recognised that those people at that stage who were travelling were essential workers. If you look out your window today, I'm not certain that this lockdown is having the same effect, where many more people than the first lockdown are travelling as if there's no difference, there is no lockdown and COVID is over, which is a disappointment. We also, Chair, put £1.5 million into a COVID-19 fund for local authorities so that they could support taxi drivers. Now, whilst taxi drivers weren't told to lock down or weren't told to close or weren't impacted directly by the government, what happened, of course, is that the reduction in footfall had a direct bearing on their ability to earn an income. And whilst it was literally a gesture, £1.5 million is a bit more than a gesture, but it's a gesture to each individual driver. It was to show solidarity with the difficulties that they were going through. And I'll just finish up, Chair, by explaining about something that we did launch called Time Out to Help Out. And it was a campaign to pay workers who were requested to self-isolate fairly. And at that stage, we were all, I think, as local politicians, getting stories told to us about people who had been contacted through Test and Trace, but were having to make the difficult sort of Damocles decision for their family of whether they went to work and earned some money and put bread on the table, or whether they stayed at home and self-isolated without any payment whatsoever. And that caused a lot of problems with the second wave. And it, as a result of the pressure and the campaigning from myself and others, the government introduced self-isolation payments, which are not at the right level, but at least it was recognition of the problem that we told the government that we were facing, and that something needed to happen. There are about 1 million other things that we've done, Chair, but I will leave it there, and what I'll do is try to tease out any of the further things that we've done in the answers to any questions that come from members.
Thank you very much for that, Mayor. Over to John to present the budget proposals.
Okay, thank you, Chair. What I was going to do was just to talk for 5 minutes or so on the context of the budget. I think the Mayor's obviously given you the headlines in terms of the main decision points. So obviously the budget for next year, as you know, as you've heard, it is quite a difficult year to make assumptions for. There are a lot of things around COVID that remain unknown and unknowable. So the budget for the combined authority obviously includes provision for transport, but also for regeneration, housing, planning, culture, employment and skills, the adult education budget, homelessness, support for the long-term unemployed, across a number of areas, and also cost of simply running the organisation as well, plus an election which obviously was due to be held last May, but will be held this May, and you know that is a cost to the combined authority as well. So these costs are picked up on the combined on the CA side, leaving transport to one side for a second, by a combination of specific grants, non-specific grants, and the mayoral precept. For next year, as you've heard, that precept will be frozen, which means we'll be slightly more reliant on grant than we would otherwise. However, you will see that there is a mayoral capacity grant of £1 million that comes from central government. We were told that would expire. This would be the last year that would be payable, but thankfully it's payable again next year. So that more than offsets the cost of not increasing the mayoral precept. So you know we're grateful for that. The grant exceeds the amount that we could raise through increasing a precept. So it's an affordable decision from that respect. Other CA costs are covered by specific grants, such as Households into Work, grants for our work with the homeless, but also in top slicing some of our investment funds to cover the administration of schemes and to cover the cost of our commercial and investment team. We're also capitalising salaries, so we're able to do that now because we've got a lot more projects that are actually in delivery than was previously the case. So a lot of those costs are considered to be project costs now. The CA does rely heavily on sharing its support services with, picking up the support services that were provided for Mersey Travel are now shared between the combined authority and Mersey Travel. I mean, we're the same organisation, obviously, but what it really means is the combined authority has not had to build a new infrastructure for things like HR, finance, payroll, IT, legal services, committee services, etc. We were able to build on what's already there, and that is a considerable saving in terms of combined authority running costs, and we need that because unlike other combined authorities, we're not funded through a subscription model from the local authorities. So we've needed to reduce our back office costs with that shared arrangement with Mersey Travel, and that continues next year. Away from the CA costs, transport is obviously a really big element of our costs, the most significant by far. And yesterday, the Transport Committee considered the transport budget and the tolls report in great depth. So I'm not going to go into great depth now, but it is impossible to consider the CA budget without understanding the implications for transport. And so going back to that transport, it is really a story about what has happened to public transport as a result of COVID. And, you know, nationally, how does the country and how does transport authorities run a transport network in the absence of revenues, which is where we're at the moment. So the events of the current year are casting a long shadow into next year's budget, particularly in transport. So it's how really do we balance those transport losses that we've experienced and also the operators, Merseyrail, Arriva, Stagecoach, principally in our areas. How do we balance those losses with what's affordable, but also what we need to be in place when recovery starts apace, and in particularly, what does that mean for transport and Mersey travel in particular? So obviously it's changed dramatically, and those changes will stay in place for as long as the government, so long as we need to abide by social distancing rules, which reduce the capacity on rail and bus significantly, and whilst people are told to work from home if they can, which again reduces demand, and obviously economic activity reduces demand significantly. So the bus industry at the moment is dependent on public subsidy from DfT, but it's also dependent on us continuing to pay them at pre-COVID levels for concessionary travel in particular, even though there are many fewer passengers. Any recovery on bus will be dependent on increased public subsidy continuing until such time as there is a viable commercial market again, in order to make sure that, you know, those socially necessary elements of the network are maintained. Very similar with rail, although the big difference is Merseyrail isn't subject to a specific recovery package from government. Merseyrail's owners are standing their own losses at the moment. The problems with rail look likely perhaps to outlast even those on bus, as patterns of work may change permanently as a result of COVID. And also, if it takes longer to get things like events at the arena and major sporting events back to full capacity, those each have really big implications for Merseyrail in particular. Also, the national picture has a huge impact on us locally. Even if patterns of work don't change dramatically in this area, if they've changed for good in the southeast, it robs the rail industry of huge amounts of commuter revenue in the southeast, which are used to offset the cost of running train operations in the rest of the country. So it will remove a huge chunk from rail globally, which will have impacts locally on the amount that's available for our own services from DfT. In terms of our direct services, obviously ferries have taken a really big hit. It's akin to having 3 consecutive winters without a summer in the middle, and we've lost virtually all our ferries revenue this year. We've taken off the river cruise, and it's purely run as a commuter service. It's particularly valuable for cyclists to get from the Wirral to the city centre. So we've kept that on as, but it's certainly been run at a huge loss this year. Again, that's been compounded by the losses we've experienced in tunnel toll revenues, as you've heard. So where we're at really is there is a huge amount of uncertainty. So the budget essentially is a holding position until we're aware of what the future will bring. Key to it will be the rollout of a vaccine and how successful that is, and then the knock-on implications in terms of social distancing, which really is the one to watch in the transport world. We're mindful of the financial challenges to local authorities, and that's why the levy hasn't increased this year, or we're proposing it isn't going to increase this year. We're not going to make any changes to the arrangements we've got with Halton around transport, which is Halton effectively provide their own services within the Borough of Halton and as a result sit outside of the main transport levy. So, and the other area of uncertainty is government support for those lost revenues, which we've had some government support this year for a portion of our losses. That will continue into next year, but we're not sure for how long, and we're not sure to what extent. So that's really is the context of the budget. On a more promising note, we did see between lockdowns acceleration of usage on Merseyrail and on our bus services that was better than the. So I think it does show that fundamentally the network is there, and hopefully once the opportunity to grow again post-COVID arises, we'll be able to take advantage of that. What the governance around that will look like, we're uncertain, and that's why there is as a mayoral priority funding available for bus recovery in particular, for hydrogen bus and for work around bus reform in the budget. The budget again, and the mayor's already mentioned, reflects other priorities such as tidal and digital, and the rolling stock as well. And we've talked about some of the projects that are going to be online next year. The rolling stock will be probably the most visible as those trains come into service next year. So I think that's all I was going to say on the budget, and hopefully that's provided you with a bit of context, and then I'm happy to answer any questions if I can that members have got. Although I would say while we're not in the same room, it might take a little bit of time to get back to you, because we're looking up paragraph references on pieces of paper and we're doing it digitally. It might not be quite as slick as if we were all in the same room. So apologies for that. But yeah, that's all I was going to say.
Thank you very much for that really helpful summary, John. That's much appreciated. Can I ask for members of the committee to indicate in the chat box if they've got questions? I'm going to try and take questions for the mayor first. So questions for the mayor in the chat box, please. And I've got a first indication from John Pugh, Councillor John Pugh.
Sorry, Tom. My question's largely for John Fogarty, so I'll pass if you like if somebody else wants to come in before that. Yeah.
I'll make a note, John. Councillor Wainwright.
Thank you, Chair. This is just a general comment, and it's a general comment regarding the Transport Committee and the fact that what was discussed at the Transport Committee has not been properly put forward to this committee. Now, I'm getting a bit fed up of being second best to a non-statutory body, which is costing the authority, to do the job it does, when we are the scrutiny organisation for the combined authority, and which is costing the authority nothing. So as soon as that's looked into, because I'm getting a bit tired of being the poor relation with regards to the Transport Committee, which isn't the statutory body, which doesn't really need to be there, and all its the business that can be conducted there can be conducted quite easily within the context of the scrutiny body.
Thanks for that comment. Before I don't know if anybody wants to respond, but just a reminder to members to please switch your camera on when you're speaking as well. Does anyone have a response to Councillor Wainwright's comment at all? Okay, I'll take that as a no. Okay. Oh, hi, Jill.
If members are minded, we can pick that up as an issue, as a matter for scrutiny to consider going forward, if that aids. Sorry, if members are minded, we can pick that up as a recommendation to think about that in the new municipal year, if that's of assistance.
I think that would be helpful, Jill. Could we have a look at that in the new year? That'd be great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Can I take a question from Councillor Sweeney, please?
Thank you, Chair. I really wanted to just thank Steve for is leadership in terms of some of the innovative programmes that have been done that are not being done in any other areas, despite the unprecedented times that we're in terms of support for business and working with all leaders of the authority, the combined authority. I know in other areas that we're struggling, obviously, massively. We're one of the most deprived areas in the country, but despite that, there has been support there. Businesses have recognised that, and individuals. So I just wanted really to put that on record, that I have been impressed, and our residents and businesses have been impressed in terms of the support that we as a combined authority have given, but also some of the innovative programmes going forward, such as the tidal project seems to be coming at pace now, the glass. So whilst there's quite a bleak outlook, there's also some real positives that we're seeing, and in terms of not putting the levy on residents, I really appreciate that, because many are struggling more than ever now with COVID. So that, although it may be a small amount, I think it's the actual gesture of acknowledgement to residents that they recognise the struggle that people are going through. Thank you, Chair.
Would the Mayor like to respond to that at all? Or...
Can I first of all thank the councillor for the kind words. What we've tried to do is to see whether we can use innovation and different approaches, almost to trial them here, and then for other areas in the country to look to what we're doing and then to replicate it. And some others are doing that. They haven't gone as quickly as us, but they're trying to put systems and mechanisms in place to do some of those things. But if I could, Chair, just the most important part of that contribution was something that Councillor Sweeney mightn't even realise she said, but she talked about we, and that's the first time I think that anybody that I've heard in the public forum has started to talk about the combined authority as we, because it's absolutely right that we are a we. It's not, look, you can have a Metro Mayor, and whoever the Metro Mayor is somebody who drives the thing, but it's the fact that we can have 6 local authority areas working in concert to try to do the right things, because that gives you scale. And the reason that government wanted to work through me is because I could speak on behalf of 1.6 million people, and through, you know, Andy in Greater Manchester, 2.6 or whatever theirs is, and through Andy Street in West Midlands, etc., etc. It's easier for them to do that through what's called the M9, the Metro Mayor 9 group, rather than nearly 350 local authorities. And so if we get more of it's we and that collective, then I'm certain that we will have projects, not just the tidal one, but I always point to people and say, Manchester, Greater Manchester had AGMA, the Association of Greater Manchester Authorities. They got a tram. When we had the opportunity to get a tram, we killed each other, and we haven't got a tram. And it is about that collective nature of working together, and we are better when we're united. So I just thought that was a very, very interesting take there, and I'd like to thank the councillor for her contribution, but also for talking about it in that manner.
I've had an indication from Councillor Wiseman.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to come in on a couple of points, really, Chair. As somebody who's served on the Transport Committee for a couple of, a year and a half, I can tell you it works cross-party, and the scrutiny on that works cross-party. I think it's really, really important to realise that what that function does, and because there's party representation for most parties on it, it does have a good value for money. And the work that's done by Liam Robinson and Gordon Friel, both councillors, together with the opposition parties, is phenomenal. And to be honest, we got new trains out of it. We're getting a lot of new initiatives. And we really need to look at the good as well as the bad. But I do agree there should be some scrutiny on it. But coming back to the budget, and particularly what's just been mentioned by Councillor Steve, the councillors and Steve Rotherham, we are one. We're only as good as the sum of our parts. And when we're talking about a budget, we're all in this. And it's really important to realise that as councillors and as members of the Liverpool City region, we have got to make sure that every pound is spent efficiently. And I think this budget does that. And I think the priorities are making sure that people can afford to go through the tunnel to work. The priorities laid out by Steve, the fact that we've got to make sure that our jobs are saved. We've got to make sure we look after taxi drivers. I've been one myself. I can see the reasoning for that before the pandemic. And I can make sure that also, when we're talking about the budget, we look at the fact that they're most vulnerable in society. And I've got to say, Steve, you and Andy have been the first to look after people and state that we've got to make sure that our young people, our people coming out of work, have those jobs and have that financial support, furlough, hospitality. It's only come. I've literally listened to both of yourself and Andy being the mainstays and looked at other parties, etc. This is not political. This is the fact that we do stand up for our people. And the budget you've laid out, I think, in the most difficult of circumstances, you prioritise those key people, the most vulnerable in society, and those out of work and those trying to find jobs. So can I just thank you for what you've done, and I will fully support what you're recommending today. Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, I'm not sure if there was a question there, if that was just a comment. Should we go on to Councillor Finneran? She had a question, I believe.
Thank you, Chair. Steve, I fully understand how hard your job must be at the moment, and I thank you for all the money in the world. I know you're going through a very difficult time, and you know you've got the support of your officers, and I can't tell you how grateful we are that you've got the staff around you. But my question is, and maybe it'd be going off the thing at the moment, but what worries me is the homeless people. What percentage of like what's happening with them? You see things on Facebook where people are going around and feeding them in the street, where we're all supposed to be self-isolating as much as we can. And I know on the last lockdown we put them into hotels. Can you give me any idea what's happening with them? I know I've gone off the subject slightly, but I think it's important. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I can answer that, Chair, if that's okay. Yeah.
Please do, yeah.
So it is a budgetary consideration because we've secured over £7 million from central government for a pilot scheme, and that's called Housing First. The idea is to treat people as human beings, to get them into a property, to get a roof over their heads, and then provide the wraparound support. And we're helping 100 people with that wraparound support across the geography, and we can get the breakdown for you if that would be helpful here. But also we're putting people into houses, and we're looking to see whether we can use innovation again, because we're working through our housing associations, because as you know, Councillor Finnan, councils don't have any housing stock anymore. You know, the council housing that we used to have, where we could work through councils to achieve our aims, our collective aims, that's not available to us. So we work through our housing associations, who've been brilliant, by the way, but it's not enough. We need to find other ways of getting people housed. Now, the scheme that the government introduced in the first wave was, what was it called? Everybody in, wasn't it? Or everyone, I think, in. And it was to try and get people off the streets. And actually, we know there shouldn't be people on the streets, but those people who were on the streets, we did get them into hotel accommodation because there was no people using that as visitors. And there are similar sorts of things. But this is the period now. If I was going to do something, this is the period now where I'd get everyone in, because it's a lot easier in spring and summer when the weather's slightly, well, a lot better than it is to sleep rough in weather like this. And I've done it. I don't know whether other councillors have done it, but I actually did it. It is horrendous when not just yourself, but your marrow is frozen, and no wonder people find it difficult to function. We need to do more as a society. We shouldn't be putting people into difficult situations where they become homeless anyway. And so we're doing our bit with this pilot, but we need to work with the government for an everybody in solution, not just now during the pandemic, but this is part of Build Back Better for me. We can be a better society. We just need the government to work with those people who have the best intentions at heart, and we can achieve it.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Steve.
No problem. Yeah, I've just got a couple of questions. I totally understand the position and what a difficult budget this has been. I thought John laid out the facts really well and kind of made the point that this is a bit of a holding position till we know a little bit more about what's coming down the line. We don't quite know how the pandemic's going to pan out. We don't know if the government will make good on their promises. So there is a bit of a period of just wait and see. But you have, and I also understand your instinct to want to shield people of the city region from increased costs. So with that in mind, you have frozen the precept. You've also frozen tunnel tolls. But it's difficult from the budget we've got in front of us to assess how many cuts you're having to make in this budget, because a lot of the tables, for example, for your own mayoral budget, you just tell us what 2021 and 2022 is going to be. There's no context of the years before, so we can't see if things are going up and down. So that's a bit of an issue. But if you do decide to freeze tunnels and you have to make cuts to bus services from there are going to be consequences of freezing some of these things. So I don't know whether freezing tunnels necessarily matches with a desire to get to zero carbon by 2040. So I wonder if there's going to be any mechanism to review this as there's a bit more certainty going forward, and if there are going to be hard decisions to be made, can we revisit certain aspects of the budget?
Thanks, Chair. We can always review budgets, because at any stage we can put forward. I can actually. I keep on saying we, and it is we, but it's the mayor that puts forward the budget, as you know, because it's a mayoral budget. So I would be able to put forward an emergency budget, and we always keep these things under review because, for instance, we don't know yet when furlough will end. And what I've always said is the best way to protect businesses is to help them to survive this period now, so that they are around when the corner is turned and we can get back to growth, hopefully. And it's the same with our public transport system. At this moment, all we're doing is eking out an existence on public transport and keeping as much of it going as we can for when we turn that corner, and then hopefully it's all there and we can start to see the increases in people using public transport. But at this moment in time, Chair, and the public health message is the most important. And we're saying to people, don't use public transport, don't get on buses. It's the first time ever that I've ever said this. I haven't got a car. I use public transport. I get it every single day. And I always say to people, what we can do is we attract more people onto public transport. It becomes a more quality and better alternative than the car, because the more people who use it, obviously, the cheaper it becomes. And the fact that then we can take more cars off the road and we can help with the emissions targets. And you're right about decarbonisation and the fact that we want to be net zero carbon. So that's the long-term aim. We've got a pandemic at the moment. We can't tell people to get on public transport. Therefore, they've got no alternative but to use cars at the moment in time. I don't want to see it as a long-term solution, but at this moment in time, they're in cars. And the last thing that I think any of us want to do would be to penalise people who have got no alternative. So yes, tunnel tolls are frozen, and that's because at this moment in time we're telling people to get into the cars, and it's supposed to be essential journeys that people are making. So it doesn't make sense to say to people we're going to penalise you further on tunnels, and that's why in the first wave we were able to offer free tunnels to essential workers, because we didn't want to penalise certain groups. Well, as I say, look out your window. Everybody can see that this lockdown is not the same as the first lockdown. People, unfortunately, are using the cars and not just in the tunnels. They're going out in large numbers. So we can't offer free tunnels this time, but neither, I don't think we should penalise those essential workers further who are doing some great work on all of our behalf. So there is a balance, and I think I've got the balance right, but I'll always review all of the aspects of the budget, because they're going to be more pressures as the government reduces and removes support mechanisms for our area.
Thanks, Mayor. John, your video's gone back on. Does that indicate you were going to make a comment there, or not? No. Okay. Does anybody have any other questions for the Mayor at all? Councillor Howard indicated. Councillor Howard.
Thanks, Chair. It's just slightly following on from Tom's question about the ability to review the budget. There's lots of ifs and buts and mentions of risk and working with other bodies, the Department for Transport, etc. in here. It's just really, really clear that there is a lot of uncertainty. You mentioned that there is the ability to go back and review this budget and potentially put through an emergency budget if that is needed. Is there a clear view of what the trigger would be for instigating an emergency budget? Sort of how far off forecast do we have to get for that to happen? What's the mechanism for initiating that?
Okay, so there's not a percentage that triggers an emergency budget. And look, I'm not going to presume that it's going to be me who's making that budget, because there will be an election in May, and at some stage after May, if there does need to be a re-evaluation of the current budget, then that's open to anybody who would become the Metro Mayor at that stage. So it's always been there. An emergency budget has always had the potential to have been put to the combined authority. It's just that we do try to manage in 12 monthly chunks. What I've tasked John with is that when we look at the budget process at the end of the pandemic, when I say that, you know what I mean. I know there's not going to be a finite end to it, but as it tails off and we do return to some sort of normality, we need to be looking at budgets for a longer period. And I think, and I've proposed that we have a medium-term financial plan that looks at a 3-year period for budget, so there is some certainty of what's going to happen, over year 2 and year 3, even though circumstances could change. So we'll just evaluate and assess what happens in post-May, and when those support mechanisms from central government start to fall off, they may well have a huge detrimental impact on our ability to do certain things, and that's where we might well have to look at the budget. But also, there may well be opportunities that come from that may well, again, be able to backfill some of the budget shortfall that we're obviously going to have. And just quickly, Chair, you did ask out, it was remiss of me not to, you said, what is the sort of the pros and cons of this. We've frozen recruitment unless absolutely essential, except for the Chief Executive, of course, because we all know that Frank Rogers is going to retire later in the year. And so we've started that process now for a Chief Executive, but you can't function without the Chief Executive. So I think people would accept that. Things like maintenance to the tunnels, again, we've delayed some of those capital works. We have to do the emergency stuff, of course we do, and we'll always put safety first. But they're getting older tunnels and they cost them much, much more every single year. And there are planned schemes for the tunnels that have said we will have to delay. I don't want to delay them, but we're going to have to do that. And we've done that with each of the budget lines to see whether we can cut anything from it. But this is not about reducing services at this moment in time. We will have to find a solution if we face that, and it is that you can cut something or that you can raise revenues from elsewhere. And they're the sort of things that at some stage in the future, somebody as the Metro Mayor is going to have to tackle.
Thank you very much for those responses. I've got no more indications for questions for the Mayor. I don't know if you're going to stick with us or not, Steve, but thank you very much for your time today anyway, yeah, and all your responses.
Thanks,
So
Chair.
we're
I've
gonna
got a TFN, if you don't mind, I'll leave the meeting, but thanks very much, and we'll look at some of the points that other members have raised.
Thanks, Steve. Bye-bye. Moving on now to questions for John. So I've had the first indication from Councillor Pugh. So if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think my question fits in pretty well actually with some of the previous questions. It's in relation to the two budgets presented to us, revenue budgets on page 17 and 18 of the report. One's the mayoral budget, quite clearly, and the other is the combined authority budget, quite clearly. And it is clarity, actually, it's the issue here. The expectation, I think, would be ordinarily that you'll see the mayoral priorities in the mayoral budget. And then what you'll see in the combined budget is a whole tranche of substantial spending coming in, revenue spending coming in from the Transport Authority. Now, I think I'm right in saying, and I apologise to John, I didn't intend the educational presentation on Tuesday, so if I haven't got the answers to these questions, it's as much my fault as it is his. In fact, it's not his at all. But you can see from the diagram, the chart on page 18, there's a lot of expenditure there that actually absorbs the mayoral budget into the combined authority budget. But on some headings, like on digital, adds more into schemes that appeared originally to be mayoral schemes. And equally, if you go back to the mayoral budget, we look at elements in there that appear to be transport schemes. Now, I'm quite relaxed about this, but obviously there is the potential here for the mayoral budget to be seen to be subsidising the transport budget, or for that matter, money raised through the levy for transport being used to support mayoral priorities. Now, we can be completely and utterly relaxed about that, but it's not clear whether that is or isn't going on in these figures. And I wonder whether in future we could find some way of presenting the figures so it's quite clear when money is added to mayoral projects, how it's being added, whether it's coming from resources that previously would have been Mersey travel resources, or whether it's coming from money top slice from the local authorities and put into the combined budget. I mean, it's all lumped in there together, and I understand that. I understand the sort of flexibility, that desirable flexibility that may exist, but it doesn't help enormously in the scrutiny process. And I wonder if John would like to comment on that. I've got one further question after that, Chair.
Yeah, it is. There's a number of reasons why we need to present it in the way we do. The first one is that the mayoral budget is that which is funded from the precept, and that needs to be shown separately under the order that established the precept, really, that established mayoral combined authorities. So there's a separate account which just shows how much we raise from precept and what that's been spent on. The transport funding is primarily on the combined authority accounts. For simplicity, really, is shown as a grant from between the combined authority to Mersey Travel. The transport committee's reports, which are available, show much more detail, as you'd imagine, than we present in the combined authorities reports around transport. In terms of cross subsidy between them, it's probably a term that we wouldn't use, because it's considered to be one organisation, really. A combined authority being akin to a local authority, and its transport function being a bit like a transport department. We would use the term group position rather than, and the combined authority is the parent body. but I take the point, and I guess without going into granular detail, the rule of thumb is that the Mersey travel accounts, if you like, that was presented to the Transport Committee, are funded from directly are funded from the transport levy and the tunnel tolls revenues. So two big items within the combined authority are around bus recovery and bus reform, and also the hydrogen bus project, which are obviously transport projects, but they're not funded from the transport levy or from tunnel tolls. They're funded from monies paid to the government, by the government, sorry, to the combined authority, Transforming Cities Fund, predominantly for Transforming Cities Fund, effectively for hydrogen bus, certainly, and also elements of the bus reform. And combined authority funding is also supporting the bus reform works. It's not something that the local authorities are picking up through the transport levy, and I think that's the distinction that we've tried to show. But you know, it's new, and we appreciate that they're difficult accounts to put together and also to present.
Could I give an example, Chair? I think it might help John in trying to deal with my queries at any rate. If we take, for example, the digital fund, which in the mayoral budget features as £381,000, it grows in the revenue budget for the combined authority, and that presumably includes that 381 to 592,000. Now, there's extra money there. One assumes, and I don't know if one's right in assuming, that that's come from some source or other, but probably not from the transport levy. It may have come from the transport levy, I don't know, but I think we ought to know whether it has come from the transport levy, and it's not apparent in these stats, you know, where it has come from, really. Yeah.
Okay, digital. Oh, sorry. To wait. Can I? Yeah, thank you. Digital, yeah, there's an element of it that's funded as a mayoral priority, but as they were really development costs over the last couple of years. Now, as the project goes live, and it's in the early stages of delivery at the moment, the combined authority, and I could get you the date of the decision, but it was this year, as is funding it through the development stage has moved on to a delivery phase. That was agreed by the combined authority, and further resources have been made available through the through the Strategic Investment Fund, which is effectively gain share revenue funding from the government. So yeah, I appreciate that there is a larger amount shown within the total project spend than is in the mayoral budget, but I think that's partly because we need to show accountability for the mayoral budget, but that's only part funding that project now. That project is essentially live.
Yeah, I mean, the problem I have is that I can't see that it hasn't been funded by the transport levy in the stats, as the figures as they stand.
Okay.
Can I go on to a second question, John, which may be quite easier to answer? I do think that what points I've raised and the point Tom's raised and the point before that Kevin Wainwright's raised, and all we're going in the same direction, because we don't have an overall feel for the transport budget, which is a big element in this. We can't answer some of the questions which might ordinarily crop up. My second question is really about the capital budget. I looked at the capital spending profile, and we raise a lot of money from the Public Works Board, but we raise a lot of money, or we borrow a lot of money from the European Investment Bank. And I think if I'm reading the papers correctly, at a lower interest rate than we do even from the Public Works Board. Is that going to change? That's a simple question. Now we're out of the European Union.
John, would you like to respond to that?
Please, John, yeah.
Yeah, well, the Public Works loan monies are available to us. They're always available to public bodies unless the government changes the rules. The European Investment Bank's monies are specifically around funding the rolling stock project. So there isn't kind of this rolling program of borrowing that we can engage in with the EIB. It was a very long and protracted negotiation with them over a number of years. Pre-referendum, this work started, but it continued post-referendum around funding that particular project. They're interested in projects rather than in organisations. So they're a really big supporter of our rolling stock project.
So if we left the European Union earlier, it would cost us more.
No, it's really complicated, but the EIB, it's up to the. I don't want to get in an area where I may be wrong, but the EIB said to us that their support for projects is not conditional on membership of the EU unless our government make it such. So they support projects that are in non-EU countries currently, but it's a moot point in a way. Is we have no projects at the moment where we're seeking EIB support.
Thanks, Chair.
They're only interested in projects that are of a very large scale, such as the rolling stock. So that may change with tidal, etc. But at the moment, there are no projects where we're looking for their support anyway. So I've tried to answer that as best I can. I know it's probably not the best answer.
Thanks, John. Thanks.
That made sense. Thanks for those responses, John, and for those questions, Councillor Pugh. Does anybody else have any questions for John? I've got one question, John. I don't know if I'm going to phrase this in a very easy to answer way, but you spoke about this as a kind of a holding position. There's a lot that's unknown about the year that's to come. How much of the budgeting has been done using assumptions that are not guaranteed at this point, or have you tried to create a budget using only the money that you know is going to be coming because of previous commitments, etc.? So is there assumptions here that could change and you might have to reduce some lines of spending, for example?
I think at the moment we wouldn't be looking to reduce lines of spend as such. I think where it may change is we may receive extended government support, which would make a big difference for ferries in particular, where we've had some compensation for losses this year. So it's issues around there. Tunnels revenue will be dependent on extent and duration of lockdown, and we've made an assumption on tunnels revenue which is what we believe is realistic. It's not overly pessimistic, but it's not optimistic either. One of the areas where that may change is around our support for the bus network and the costs of that, which are articulated through supported bus costs and concessionary travel payments. But what we won't be doing is altering service provision or policies. It's just that we're encouraging government to pay some of the subsidy. Combined authorities as a sector are encouraging government to pay the subsidy that they currently pay directly to bus operators, to pay that through combined authorities or through transport authorities, so that we have a greater say in network support. And if that conversation with government goes the way in which combined authorities hope it goes, that would need a revision to the budget as well. And that would be it would be neutral in its impact, because the money that we would get would be helping support the network, but it would be we would need to recognise it in the budget. I would say in terms of budget revisions in 2020-21, the year we're in now, obviously because of the sudden and dramatic impact of COVID and lockdowns, and then various iterations of government support, we made a significant change to budgets in November, we took a revised budget to the Combined Authority in November to recognise what's happened this year. I would expect that we'll be doing similar in next year in probably a similar time frame. Sorry.
Thank you, John. I've had indication from Councillor Cameron.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask, I understand why you got a holding budget, and I understand that the borrowing is predominantly about the rolling stock, and we discussed that at length. But you're also changing your minimum revenue provision, and this budget really depletes the reserves through not raising the levies or the precept. So with the reserves depleted and the MRP policy changing, has it been run by Mazars? Because my very first introduction to the Combined Authority and this role was where Mazars came in to go back 2 or 3 years to correct something. So I don't want to be in a position where auditors retrospectively recommend something different, and changing the MRP policy now with so much uncertainty in a holding budget and the grand plans we have for capital expenditure. I just want to know if we've gone through that in advance as opposed to retrospectively.
If I may come in, Chair, just to answer Councillor Cameron's question around minimum revenue provision. Ahead of us making a change to our MRP policy, we have engaged fully with Mazars on this. So a briefing note was issued to them, and that has been through their technical team. And essentially what we are seeking to do has 2 parts to it. Firstly is looking at our old, what is known as supported borrowing minimum revenue provision. Now, without getting too technical, there was what I'd call a traditional method approach where a 4% reducing balance was applied. And over a number of years, councils have increasingly challenged back as to whether that is a prudent approach to trying to write off your old historic debt. And this is debt for which in previous years support was received from government. However, when that ended, it became a cost to councils, and the Combined Authority, to all intents and purposes, a council. So what we've looked to do is to try and remove the 4% reducing balance and to seek to write off in full our old supported borrowing over a period of time. This isn't something that is particularly controversial. It's something that we are actually fairly late in adopting compared with other councils. So it's a position that Mazars are comfortable with. With regards to the proposals of what we would like to do for any new borrowing, again, we have engaged fully with Mazars, and clearly before we actually would undertake any borrowing or invoke any of those, we would seek to ensure that the way we applied it was appropriate and that we had full backing of the auditors before we'd actually do anything.
Thank you. That helps with the context. So in terms of some of the historic borrowing, are we coming full circle here? Is the tunnels and also the infrastructure around the ferries, is that the bulk of the historic borrowing, over on the Birkenhead side where the ferries come in, and also the tunnel, is that part of it? Because obviously that predates my time on this committee.
And unfortunately also predates me somewhat. I do understand that historic borrowing will cover those, but it won't just be those 2 items. And as the council appreciate, under any prudent Treasury approach, what the authority has sought to do is, when there has been the opportunity to reschedule debt, loans have been bundled and have been rescheduled to ensure that we have the most appropriate interest rate structure on our borrowing. So clearly over time that link between specific assets and your borrowing will decrease, but obviously that will form part of it.
Thank you, that helps. And I did hope, sorry Chair, if I could just ask John the end to my line of questioning. So obviously capital programmes are going forward and the economy and everything, yes, it's really important to rebuild. I just want to know if you feel that the risk appetite increases where the ownership model changes. I want to see the same approach applied to any capital investment, any infrastructure, any large projects, regardless of whether it is a private collaboration or private enterprise or public ownership. You know, like, for example, Wirral Waters, we're all excited about, but obviously I expect to see an acceleration in projects because ownership models have changed. But I want to know that the appetite for the risk is the same regardless.
Yeah, I think we've got, as you know, we've got a commercial and investment team that deal with our investments, strategic investment fund. We've got an investment panel. We've got you know, and we've got governance that ultimately has the combined authorities decision making on our investment portfolio, within which we have different levels of risk within the portfolio, as you'd expect, but we manage that. We manage that accordingly. I think probably not the best place to talk about it in any scheme specific details, because, as I say, we've got we've got a team that do that and work with your growth directors quite closely at the moment. So that would be Mark Bousfield, who's our Director of Commercial Investment, who manages the portfolio on the CA's behalf. Well, clearly we do understand the importance of getting schemes off the ground, regardless of the ownership model, because the biggest risk is non-delivery, and the biggest risk is that the city region doesn't recover as quickly as it ought to do, because, you know, we've been given these funds for a reason, and we need to have the architecture, the risk appetite, and the arrangements in place to turn that funding into delivery as quickly as we can with partners.
Thank you. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much for all those responses, John. I don't have any more indications of any more questions, so just thanks from everybody for your time today. And to the committee, can we agree the recommendations on page 9 of the report?
Agreed.
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 Agreed. Agreed.
Thank you all very much for that. That's excellent. So moving on to item 5, it's public engagement at the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. This report was deferred at the last meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee and has been brought to today's meeting for consideration. Can I invite Trudy Bedford, Scrutiny Officer, to take us through the report, please?
Thank you, Chair, and apologies. It would appear there's some issues with my camera, so I can't turn my camera on right now, so whether they just want to keep the slide up for the time being. This report was presented to the committee at its last meeting, but was deferred to this committee. It follows on from a public question submitted by Unlock Democracy to a meeting of the Combined Authority in March last year. Unlock Democracy were asking for the Combined Authority to consider whether a public question time could be included on the agendas for Overview and Scrutiny Committee meetings. To facilitate that response, some research has been undertaken where we've compared the arrangements other combined authorities currently have with regards to public question times, and that is set out in paragraph 4.3 of the report. A concern for officers in having a public question time for overview and scrutiny is that the process may become frustrating for members of the public and committee members. By the very nature, the questions that might be received by the committee may be ones where only combined authority members can respond to them directly, and there is already that provision on a combined authority agenda. Noting that public engagement within Overview and Scrutiny Committee is key and pivotal, We are looking to provide a more meaningful engagement process for members of the public, and the report proposes two mechanisms for that, which are set out in paragraph 5. The first is a public question time opportunity, but it would be targeted towards work of task and finish groups, which would be reported back to the committee, and or specific scrutiny activity. The agenda would be marked accordingly, so members of the public could see where they could ask questions, and that approach would be facilitated through democratic services as it is for combined authority meetings. To broaden public engagement further, it's also proposed that a scrutiny referral process is introduced. This would allow residents to submit a topic for consideration by the committee, which could then either form a task and finish group or a more detailed report to a future committee. Again, the mechanics behind this would be developed further, and the chair and the vice chair members of the committee would be involved in considering those topics that come forward and determining how best to address them. Finally, just to add that any changes to the arrangements of the committee would need approval by the combined authority, as they would be constitutional changes. I'm happy to take any questions, Chair, and I would draw members' attention to the recommendations at page 65. Thank you.
Thank you, Trudy. Does anybody have a question about this report?
Chair, you'll have to excuse me. I've got no little hand to indicate. Can I ask? Can I ask, because I've got to? I should have actually gone 10 minutes ago for another meeting. When people are actually asked the question, I think it's quite right that they are given the right to do that. But can we not allow them a supplementary question that is based on the answer that they've been given? Usually it's the supplementary question that clarifies the original question in the first place, and not necessarily the answer. I don't think it's really a problem with doing that, but I think they have to be given every opportunity to be able to go away after they've asked the question, to understand what is actually being told to them with the response. So it's quite a simple request, Chair, that they be asked to be allowed to have a supplementary after, but it has to be based on the agenda. And the supplementary has to be based on the answer they've received.
Thank you for that suggestion. Trudy, is that something that can be accommodated, do you think?
Yes, and currently within the constitution for the combined authority, that is the process that is in place for questions to combined authority meetings. So we would look to replicate that as well, yes, so that members of the public can ask a follow-up question, but it needs to be based on the topic of their original submission.
Thank you, Trudy. And just a comment from myself, I mean, I supported the call from Unlock Democracy for some participation. I think it's really good that we open ourselves up to as much scrutiny as possible. So I'm really grateful to the work you've done to get the process started, Trudy. So thank you for that. I've got no other questions indicated. So can I ask if the recommendations as set out on page 65, paragraph 2.1 of the agenda are approved, please? Is that approved?
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah. Agreed.
Agreed. Agreed.
Thank you all for that. So the final item is any other business, and I don't have anything further. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending and declare that this meeting is closed.